Hello and welcome to another episode of The Defenders on Sunset TV. And in this episode, we are looking at something which is a bit futuristic. There is, ever since the India-China standoff, increasingly a debate at various circles in South Bloc and particularly in the Army headquarters about the need to have a multi-pronged approach to use of tanks and armored vehicles in conflicts. Because earlier, the thinking was largely dominated by tank formations and tank commanders who looked at vast open areas from India's Pakistan boundary, coming from Jammu area, across Punjab, Rajasthan and Gujarat, because that was the ideal operational playground for tanks. But more and more now, there is now the need to come up with an approach on how to deal with the Chinese threat in the Himalayas and how mechanized forces in general and light tanks in particular will be able to provide us that answer which we are looking for. And we are lucky today to have with us people who understand this subject like the back of their hand. We have with us Lieutenant General Ashok Shivane, who, of course, retired at a very high rank and was also Director General Mechanized Forces, but has had the good experience of having commanded, amongst other things, what was earlier known as the Mechanized Division when I served in it, but later the Armored Division, and there a lot of discussions and initial doctrinal thinking took place on the use of light vehicles which are part of the mechanized forces such as the ICV, BMP 1 and 2. And we have Major General Anil Dere, an old friend who has been a leading spark in armored circles, having commanded a division, having been our defense attaché in Washington and on the directional staff of the National Defense College. So, impeccable credentials, both of you gentlemen. And General Shivane sir, I'd start with you. Now, help me understand, what is it that these new light vehicles or light combat vehicles would do, what the BMP can't do? I know the BMP has been around for 4 decades or more. I know it is now need for a change in that kind of equipment, but we have a factory that manufactures that. If we go in for new equipment, we need a gestation period. We need new philosophies, standard operating procedures. We need new training mechanisms. So why is there this desperation for change?
Right. Thank you, Maruf, firstly for the invite. Let me straight away get on to your question. And to make our viewers understand the questions, the foundational construct of this question is that the utility of a force is dependent on its deployability, employability, and capability.
Yes.
Now, let us look at this gamut of these 3 factors when you talk of light vehicles. When you talk of the deployability, it essentially means its strategic, operational, and tactical mobility, which is specific to a terrain, which may inhibit larger or medium-sized vehicles to permit, to operate in that area. Therefore, it requires air mobility. It requires low ground pressures to go over low classification bridges, and it requires low turning radius to go on its own steam. The next factor, that is this question of employability. Employability is related to its multi-spectrum employability as such, whether it's in the high altitudes, whether it's in the obstacle-ridden terrain, whether it's in the run-of couch, amphibious operations, protection of island territories, even in UN as such. And therefore, when you look at the capabilities that you're looking at, I will not talk of a vehicle, but I'll look at capability. You require something when you're looking at northern and eastern borders, you require something which has got a high angle firing capability of a weapon system which has the desired lethality. You require a vehicle which has a low ground pressure, which can move over areas, over bridges, can go over streams and flotations, provided the speed of the water is that limited, and it can have a small turning radius.
So effectively what you are saying, you just need a better BMP.
I won't say a BMP because we have to understand that there is a classification of vehicles which is an infantry combat vehicle which has a specific role, and there is a classification of tanks, heavy, medium and light, which is a different role.
Understood, sir. Okay, General Dere, this is a broad question and then we'll come to the specifics. In the experience of the Ukraine conflict, which all of us have been studying and trying to imbibe lessons from that for our operational environment, is it fair to say that the use of anti-tank equipment and the use of drones has suddenly raised questions about the efficacy and the ability of tank forces to achieve their targets, particularly since most of our mechanized forces are of the same type that the Russians are using in Ukraine?
Maruf, I'd like to go back a little bit in history. If you look at the evolution of the tank, it came about during the First World War. And ever since it has been evolving. Even at that point in time, at the end of the First World War, there was talk that, the tank had outlived its utility, it was never going to be utilized. But surprisingly, it continues to exist and it has evolved into a very lethal fighting machine. And you take the Second World War, you look at the Yom Kippur War or wars in other theaters, look at the wars in India itself, India versus Pakistan. So my point is that it has evolved, it's there to stay. Now, the other important aspect we have to understand is as you have various kinds of ammunition which are produced to defeat armor, the armor itself has to evolve in the way it's going to work. So my point there is that as the evolution takes place, you are in a position today you have active protection systems, you have electronic countermeasures. So there are ways in which you can counter what the enemy is throwing at you. So that evolution is an important process. And I think some people have got carried away by videos that they've seen, on YouTube, etc., of some tanks getting destroyed. But we have to understand that we have our own operational concepts, the way we operate. It's a combat team, it's a combat group. You have to operate in an environment where you've got air defense, you've got weapons which can knock down drones, when you have an active protection system which is going to protect your tank from any of these oncoming, projectiles. So I think the tank is there to stay. It is more to do with the evolution and the way you're likely to fight and utilize the weapon platform that you have at your disposal.
Okay, so General Saab, you were talking about, the terms of reference that you employed in terms of formulating the QR for what you need in terms of a light tank. And one of the areas that struck me is that you need comprehensive solutions for weapon systems, gunners, main sights, also giving the commander a panoramic vision of the battlefield, fire control systems, etc. And somewhere I read that as of now, our ICVs, infantry combat vehicles, are virtually blind at night, which is not true because they had II vision, image intensifiers, and which work on ambient light and on the moon. So I'm familiar with that. So what is it? And the Chinese are already come up with a whole string of new equipment, which is precisely doing the kind of things that you are wanting our people to do. So my question is, how are we, what is the timeline we are looking at, and how are we going to bridge the gap?
See, technologies exist both in terms of lethality, agility, and survivability. And we've come a long way in our upgrades of the armored fighting vehicles, whether it be the tanks or the ICVs as such. So what we need is actually a time sensitivity and a platform which bridges the capability to operate in areas where presently the medium tanks cannot operate. There is no point going for capabilities which may take 8 to 10 years and could carry on to 15 years. So therefore, we need capabilities in the next 3 to 4 years, and we have to bridge this. Therefore, one, we need to go for a spiral approach to capabilities, Mark 1, Mark 2, Mark 3. 2, we need a mix of medium and light tanks to have two factors in mind, a strategy of denial and a strategy and a deterrence of credible deterrence, which is based on QPQ options being available. 3, when we talk of any platform, be it light tanks, we have to talk of a IBG or a combined arms team. And that is where the light tank in those valleys, those passes, and those plateaus will be the front runner and the harbinger of heading these IBGs. So therefore, I would say we have to, priority one, bridge the gap of next to 3 to 5 years of its manifestation on ground. 2, bring in capabilities which are essentially required, which the medium tank does not give you, which is operating mobility in those areas, which is high angle firing, and tactical mobility, including flotation if required in those areas.
Okay, your point well made. My question still hankers in my mind, which is based on the People's Liberation Army of China has deployed a mixture of medium and light tanks, which is what you are talking about, generation type 15.
Correct.
And they are all looking at platforms less than 25 tons. Okay. As far as I remember, I think the BMP was some 23.86 tons or something like that. Now, the issue, what I'm not hard selling the BMP, I'm basically saying that is it possible, as the general is bringing out, that what we have is made to stretch for another 4 or 5 years and give them adequate missile capability to overcome the firepower shortages that can be given to them with either added attachments of shoulder-fired missiles or whatever? Or is it possible, and you've been a DA abroad, is it possible to look at quick imports to overcome that timeline issue till what we need to produce, that Make in India and Atmanirbhar Bharat and things being announced by the Prime Minister on 3rd March this year, that is achieved? Because I remember years ago, General Sundarji once saying in an interview that, a state-of-art equipment takes you 15 to 17 years to produce.
See, Maruf, I think over the years we faced a challenge. This issue of a light tank, I remember when we were commissioned, way back in the early 80s, this debate has been on in the army that do we need a light tank or not? And it's first and foremost, we must realize that we did have a light tank. We had the light tank in the PT-76, which we used very effectively during the war in Bangladesh.
Yes.
And it was an excellent platform. But it had outlived its life. Now, as we move ahead, there has always, the need has always been felt. Now, the point that you're trying to make is that you have a BMP which has a capability, and will that be able to carry out the same role by giving it, some sort of additional
Shorten
armament
the arm
terms?
for a few years.
Yeah, but I think the bigger challenge there is that yes, it is an option, but looking at protection, because the BMP, with whatever weight it has very little armor protection. If you're looking at survivability, the point that General Shivane was making, if you needed to survive in a battlefield that is likely to, that we're going to be fighting in, then it's important that that platform that you have also has the adequate protection for its crew members, it's able to survive. And I think only having a missile may not really serve the purpose. You would require a main gun. Now, how do you get that main gun in? Because you need to do a bit of pinpoint firing. You can't keep firing missiles all over the place. So with that in mind, I think it is important that we do go in for a light tank, firstly. And secondly, about it being imported or developed indigenously, I think the general trend now has been that whatever we do going forward is manufactured in India. So I suppose it's how soon that we get our act together and can manufacture something which meets our requirements.
Well, getting our act together has a history of its own. And, I remember speaking to people at the highest level, and they say every service chief has his own wish list.
True.
Now, who do we respond to? And everyone builds it out that my theatre is the theatre which is going to face the maximum impact in battle. So I need this ASAP. General Saab, I want you to explain that due to the operational difficulties faced with large battle tanks, MBTs, in mountain warfare, the Chinese have come up with the ZTQ-15 light tanks that can easily zoom around in the mountains and also can operate in a way that they have some cutting edge firepower with them. So it's mobility and firepower, which are the two essences of mechanized warfare. Now, anybody who's going to come up with something is going to have to produce a convincing argument that what you are going to get for the country will provide us that counter to that mobility and firepower for at least the next 2 decades. What's your takes?
Absolutely. So let me say that we have come of age from talking of firepower, mobility, and protection to lethality, agility, and survivability. That's manifested today. So when you talk about the Chinese TPQ-15 opposite us, a 35-ton tank, called a light tank, a 34-ton, 35-ton used to be a T-54 when I joined, and used to be called a medium tank. But that apart, the weight is not so important, the capability. And therefore, you have to generate a capability which is more superior for a combat overmatch. So therefore, one, you require a main gun which is able to outgun it and out-lethality, create a better lethality. You ought to have a mobility or a agility for it to be able to go to those areas where the TPQ-15 may not be able to go. Today, you have the T-72s and the T-90s, but there are certain areas, and I'm talking from ground because I've been to each of the subsectors, both in the northern front and in the eastern front. We have carried out studies of goings for medium tanks and light tanks. And therefore, there are certain areas where the medium tank would take a very long time and a large effort to be able to go there. And therefore, if you're looking at time, space, and force superiority over the adversary, then these areas you require a mix of medium and light tanks, which can have a main gun with a missile firing capability, and like I told you, the mobility in terms of agility to operate, and above all, the ability to be transportable, low drop, para drop, or multiple tanks being brought to those valleys, or being moved on its own steam with minimum logistics as such.
Okay, that all I'm familiar with. I believe some of them have been airlifted also, and there are trials in place of that kind of weight
True.
category. Quick question, sir, before I move to General Dairy. If within this, by 26 January, I'm not saying today, I'm saying by 26 January or by February, the government gives the go-ahead, ki, okay, start manufacturing this. What is the timeline in which they will be, at least a squadron of 14, 15 tanks will be available to our troops on the front line?
On?
The front line.
Okay.
If the go-ahead is given. Quick question, quick answer, I need to go to him.
Quick question
For you, sir.
is, if you're going to import them, you're going to get them within a year, right?
Right.
And you have to look at your vulnerability, your value, and your risk that you're going to take.
Right.
If you're looking at a joint collaboration and then going in for something which has a totally indigenous character, it'll take at the least minimum 3 to 5 years for its manifestation, provided there's a collaboration. If you go for a virgin ground of starting, then your guess is as good as my guess, having seen the historical perspective of evolution of
So,
this tank.
to be honest about it, if you want to buy it, we can buy it within a year. Otherwise, the plans and trials and everything generally being put into place about 5 years and 10 years more for manufacturing. So, I'm just broadly guessing, but I think that's been the history and the tradition. General Dairy, last question to you. You know, I've been talking to Air Force officers, and the obsession in the Air Force is give me 42 squadrons, without which I can't give you your airspace safety. I don't buy that argument. And some former air chiefs also don't buy that argument. The thing is, what do you provide in between to overcome that shortage of 42 squadron, God willing, which will be made up by 2040 or whatever? What do you provide to the forces who are shouting back to you that give me something to counter the Chinese light tanks in the Himalayas? My one guess is, and a study I did years ago, was the effective use of attack helicopters. Because attack hepters, as a rule, at least the AH-64 Apache that you are familiar with, would probably knock out at least a squadron of tank or more before they get knocked out. Can they be used effectively in the mountains? I've just seen pictures of the Navy's Poseidon and others being used in the LAC area for reconnaissance. Can they be used? Because one of the things that attack helicopters thrive on is foliage and cover. That's not there in the mountains. Your view?
Yeah, but listen, the point is that, like General Shivane was saying, he's been through the area. There are a large number of valleys. There are folds in the ground. So it's not, you may not have cover in terms of trees, but the lay of the ground is such that there are so many valleys that you can come through, carry out an attack, and then again disappear.
Right.
So it is possible.
Right.
It is how you use terrain. I mean, the acme or the skill of a soldier is how best he can use the ground that is available to his advantage.
Yeah.
So I'm sure that's a bit of training. That is all that is required, and I'm sure our air crews who fly these helicopters will be, in a position to perform. And coming back to the point of, combined teams, I think that is where the whole issue is based on, because it's not that it's a tank which is going to fight all by itself. These are all on, battle groups, combat teams, with the resources that they have. So when we go into battle today, it's not going to be a tank. You're going to have the air defense, you're going to have electronic countermeasures, electronic countermeasures, anti-drone, anti-aircraft. So everything thrown in together is, if we have that kind of a package, I'm sure, our army is capable of performing in any kind of terrain. And another point I'd like to add, when you look at, warfare in the subcontinent, it all revolves around real estate. You cannot afford to lose any ground. And if that be so, the battle has to be fought on land. And that's where we come in.
Absolutely. And General sir, last thoughts, because you were DGMF. Increasingly, we are talking about inter-service integration. Increasingly, we are talking about the use of Navy for extending India's footprint. You mentioned in one of your earlier answers about amphibious operations and other things that you thought of. And amphibious operations, as I understand, is not just crossing one Nala or the other. Amphibious operations is also landing from LSTs and getting into occupying island territories. Do you think these would be as good an option for amphibious operations as the traditional ICV, BMPs have been?
Certainly. You see, in 80s we did a full-fledged trial, which is completed, and light tank approved, IKB-91 of the Swedish.
yeah.
It was done in Bengal. It was done with a scheme of mind of having an amphibious tank. It was put on LST. Everything was carried out on the seas also. So therefore, when you look at a light tank, you're not, our capability building approach is based on threat come capability. But we have to look increasingly at capabilities, because otherwise we'll continue to be reactive.
Yes.
So if you're looking at capabilities of the future, then we have to look at amphibious capabilities. We have to look at capabilities. How do we operate in built-up areas? How do we operate in obstacle-ridden terrain, which is increasingly happening, besides the Northern Front and the Eastern Front?
Okay. So, well put, and lots of good points have come out. And I hope the people who matter are listening, because this is a decision that needs to be taken quickly in the interests of our territories being suitably guarded. And I'm grateful to both the general officers for your views, and thanks to you for watching. Until our next episode, goodbye.